Welcome to the Frontline Herbalism podcast with your host Nicole Rose from the Solidarity Apothecary. This is your place for all things plants and liberation. Let's get started. Hello, welcome back to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. Today's episode is all about herbal support for trauma. So I'm kind of trying to give a little bit of a flavor of what's in the Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress course by giving a kind of framework of how I work with plants to respond to trauma. So I introduced a little bit about what is trauma, common trauma dynamics, collective responses to traumatic stress, and then, go into like how can plant medicines help us with trauma, looking at different sorts of nervines and herbs that have an affinity with the nervous system. So it's kind of like, sneak peek of things that I go into in much more depth in the course, but I hope it is valuable for you. The course, the Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress course, is still open for enrollment until Sunday, the 13th of April. So I'm so overwhelmed by how many people have been supportive. I put an email out on my email list yesterday asking if folks could just share it on their networks because I'm kind of struggling at the moment. If you didn't know, the course is obviously like an amazing offering, but it is also like the main way I generate funds for the Solidarity Apothecary. So that means like every course contribution goes towards paying for all the costs involved in making herbal care packages that go out to frontline organizers around the world, like protest sites, occupations, grassroots groups like resisting oppression, like all over the place. It pays for hundreds of prisoners' herbal books to go out every single month, again, across the world. And it also covers my time in everything that I do in terms of workshops and creating content and supporting people one-to-one, which is something I'll be returning to. When I used to go to Calais, it would also kind of enable me to do that with the mobile herbal clinic, for example. So I want to keep doing this work of supporting people experiencing state violence, like with herbalism. And just everyone's support is just amazing in helping keep this project going and enabling me to focus on it full time. So thank you for all your support. Please check out the course page if you haven't heard about it. Please share this episode with anyone who you think is curious about the roles that herbs can play in, the kind of, the suffering and the life experiences and the hardship that humans go through all over the world. And I know that harm is definitely not evenly distributed in terms of who is experiencing oppression, but all humans like suffer and go through life experiences of distress and grief and loss and change, and plants can accompany us over a lifetime. So that's why I love them so much. Anyway, thank you for listening. I will let you get on with the episode. Okay, take care. Bye. Okay, so I'm going to dive into herbal support for trauma. And just a couple of content warnings that I do reference kind of traumatic things as like little examples. I don't go into loads of detail, but I might be like, for example, you can see this in an abusive relationship or you can see this in prison. Just a kind of heads up that that's in this episode. If you want to skip forward to the herbal content, I totally understand. And I'll do my best to kind of keep the trauma related things at the beginning of the episode. What is trauma? So there is no single definition. It comes from the Greek word for wound or damage. And one kind of framing that I really like is that trauma is a distressing, disturbing, or wounding experience or injury experienced in many ways over a lifetime. Because I think lots of people will be like, I haven't experienced trauma, but have you ever experienced distress, for example? And I think most humans, or nearly all humans, will through their lifetime. And also distress looks differently, right? Like maybe that's losing a loved one, or maybe that's having a car accident. It's like, I think distress is kind of a kind of inclusive way of framing the huge spectrum of life experiences that someone can go through over a lifetime. But trauma is also starting to be recognized as like the response to these experiences. So the response in the body and the nervous system to a distressing, disturbing, or wounding experience. That I explore that a lot more in the Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress course, where I dive into all of this stuff in much more detail. But just to kind of set the scene, like we explore in the course like common trauma dynamics, and I'm going to run through like a few of these now. So yeah, often there is a threat to life. So that means maybe our life is threatened, or we are witnessing someone else's life be threatened. You know, in traditional PTSD literature, that might be like seeing someone in a car accident, for example, or being in a car accident yourself. Maybe it's, being in a fucking genocide and, experiencing and witnessing death like relentlessly. Or, it could also be feeling like your life is threatened. So, for example, growing up in a kind of violent household where you're regularly fearing for your safety, that is a kind of common trauma dynamic that encapsulates like threat to life. Trauma will commonly like alter or destroy our assumptions of safety. And not everyone grows up with a feeling of safety by any means, but oftentimes people might have like a baseline sense of the world as being kind of safe. And then that's just, completely altered by trauma. So, for example, if someone has had like a general, okay dynamic with other humans and relating and different partners and things, and then experiences sexual assault, for example, that might kind of alter or destroy their assumptions of safety, like there forward. Trauma often also involves situations of abandonment and powerlessness. So that can mean that we're rendered helpless by like an overwhelming force. And that can be something like like a tsunami or like a quote unquote natural disaster. Because, I know people challenge the concept of natural disasters because so many of them are attributed to like human induced climate change or capitalism induced climate change. But yeah, often it's like being rendered helpless by something more powerful than ourselves. Trauma often involves disconnection from others. So, for example, that could be like social alienation, in an abusive relationship that disconnects you from other people, or, an institution like prison or psychiatric hospital, for example. And yeah, a common trauma dynamic is captivity. So this, has like a whole range of trauma dynamics, such as like an inability to escape, prolonged and repeated coercive control, threat of death or harm, isolation, submission, violation of our own moral principles, and dehumanization. And I kind of go into each of those in more depth in the course, but just to kind of give you an overview. And yeah, trauma generally instills fear, right? And fear can look like, moving forward, that can look like intense anxiety or hypervigilance or distress, nightmares, things like this. And it is worth naming that trauma is often not just like a standalone thing, like it commonly compounds with like other traumatic experiences. So, someone might have a very traumatic childhood with a lot of abuse and neglect, and then, for example, end up in the prison system, or, they might end up having like an abusive relationship when they're older, or experience sexual trauma, something like this. Or maybe someone has grown up with like intense racism and racial trauma, and then they've experienced that with like the birth of their child and experienced birth trauma and medical trauma. Like all of these forms of trauma like commonly kind of interact with each other and build. And yeah, it's not just one. Like this kind of compounding nature is very real. So yeah, how can trauma affect the body? It is worth saying that there are like patterns of how the body expresses distress, and that would lead to frameworks such as, a PTSD diagnosis. And, the course has a whole lesson all about exploring the like political consequences of using language like diagnosis or tools of psychiatry and things as tools of oppression. But I like to think that people will self-identify what like works for them and what's empowering for them, because diagnostic labels can be empowering for some people. But yeah, like there are like common patterns of how the body expresses distress, but we all kind of have our own like fault lines. So we all have our own ways. Someone's anxiety might result in a lot of kind of like gut issues or diarrhea or, gut related anxiety, and someone else's that might result in like musculoskeletal pain, for example. So yeah, I just want to say that, we're intimately connected to our environments, and like everything we go through in our lives is shaping our body and our kind of physiology like all the time. Okay, so yeah, these kind of patterns that I've put together in the course of how the body expresses distress are like sleep disturbances,
changes in worldview, memories, flashbacks and triggers, chronic disconnectedness, arousal and reactivity. And yeah, I go into kind of depth about what they look like, but I'm just going to give like a kind of summary. So starting, I think, with the most common, which is this like arousal and reactivity. And I don't mean arousal like a kind of sexual arousal. I mean arousal as in like you're like on like high alert and you're activated. So if you think about it, like if you had been like attacked by a bear, for example, it would make sense that you were like waiting to be attacked again, that every time you went for a walk in the woods, you'd be hypervigilant that you're going to find a bear and it's going to happen again. So, you know, it is like absolute kind of survival part of the nervous system. And yeah, this like arousal and reactivity involves the sympathetic nervous system. So again, in the course, I dive into like nervous system physiology, and that's why it's really important to understand these kind of different aspects of the nervous system. So yeah, hyperarousal looks like kind of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So this is our like fight, flight, freeze response. And I talk about that a lot more in the course when we do the nervous system deep dive. But yeah, generally we're in sort of like this fight and flight kind of activated state. There's often like a high emotional charge, and often like after trauma, there's like an increasing reactivity over time. Hypervigilance. So for example, feeling constantly on edge, scanning for danger, suspicion, muscle tension. Like I said, like if you're walking into the woods where you've been attacked by a bear, you're going to be on kind of high alert. And yeah, there are often real expressions of anger and rage, and on a kind of lower level, like irritability. There might be feelings of grief. There might be feelings and kind of desires for revenge and like needing to kind of like fight this sort of injustice, if that makes sense. Often this kind of reactive state comes with like quote unquote like impaired emotional control. So someone isn't necessarily capable of really like regulating their emotions and kind of staying like quote unquote calm. Like, you know, they feel a sense of aggression and hostility. And often, you know, this kind of trauma response results in like destructive behavior, for example, recklessness or, self-harm or suicidality, or kind of seeking respite from the distress with things like drugs or alcohol or workaholism, for example. And I know those are all like really complex areas. You know, I've done workshops and trainings around supporting people who are suicidal, for example. So I just want to give a disclaimer that these are all really, really complicated things that we go into more depth in the course. But yeah, with this sort of arousal and reactivity response, like we have basically like this heightened fear of the world. And there's this altered baseline, right? So there's a kind of reference to this like fear of the ordinary. So it's not like you're frightened and everything makes sense because you should be frightened. For example, living in like a literal genocide, like in Gaza, for example. It's more like once something is over and you're still experiencing that same level of fear, that is kind of what trauma looks like in the body. Does that make sense? So yeah, often there's feelings of overwhelm, and, you know, people can be completely paralyzed by a sense of overwhelm. And, you know, that can lead to things like difficulty concentrating, for example, things like panic attacks, but also just like anxiety, just like generalized, unfocused anxiety, like this feeling of kind of dread and like innate despair. Okay, and another aspect of how distress is kind of moving through the body is like sleep disturbances, right? So people will have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. They often commonly have insomnia. There'll be patterns of nightmares and distressing dreams. And that's something that Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress goes into a lot more depth around things like nutritional deficiencies that affect your sleep and that can cause or contribute to worsening nightmares, you know, as well as things like, you know, the amazing variety of plants that can help you sleep, but, you know, can also worsen nightmares sometimes. So I talk about all those nuances in depth. Another aspect of trauma is chronic disconnectedness. So, for example, relationship challenges, you know, struggling to trust people, struggling to feel safe, feeling fearful when like interacting with other people, potentially self-isolating altogether, feeling alienated, having kind of diminished interest in like socializing and connection. And there's also this like self-disconnection, you know, like sensations of dissociation or feeling numb or feeling hopeless. And then, yeah, changes in worldview are like a large factor in trauma. So there is often this like moment of kind of rupture where like our assumptions of safety about the world, about, you know, the meaning of life, about our purpose, you know, maybe we have like a relationship with God that we lose, for example, when, you know, going through something traumatic. There's often a feeling of being kind of betrayed. Yeah, there's often a sensation of grief or guilt or shame, feeling unlovable. You know, generally trauma comes with negative beliefs about ourselves and about the world, you know, that we come to expect the worst, you know, and often that can lead to even just a feeling of like really not caring if we live or die, for example. And yeah, there's often this kind of constant state of stress. So feeling the strain and pressure, and that, you know, we don't have the resources to meet the demands of our lives, and that life is like exceeding our ability to cope. And that's because our nervous system is not just dealing with the here and now, it's also dealing with like everything we've been through, for example. And, you know, there's loads of factors that contribute to what worsens these dynamics, things like uncertainty and lack of information and loss of control. And yeah, I go into that stuff in much more depth in the course. Yeah. And then the other kind of category in this common ways that the body expresses distress is memories, flashbacks, and triggers. And, you know, this is like a big section in and of itself, but it's really common for people who've experienced trauma to experience like recurrent involuntary and distressing memories. On the other foot, people can also have a lot of amnesia and memory loss and challenges in kind of recall. In the course, I talk more about what flashbacks are, you know, that they're sort of unintegrated, unprocessed memories of like an overwhelming event. And triggers are like emotional and physiological reactions to reminders of, you know, and like warnings of what is safe and not safe. And, you know, they're not just historical. It's not just like, oh, this happened, so therefore it's my trigger. It's also like, this person's being like racist right now, and that is like a current trigger. Does that make sense? Often there is like an avoidance of triggers a lot, but people can also be drawn to their triggers. And, you know, especially when trauma has become a sort of source of meaning and aliveness. And, you know, I've definitely seen this in people that do sort of like frontline kind of organizing type work. So yeah, there's also, you know, like a whole plethora of emotional strategies to cope with trauma, like people minimizing things, saying everything is fine, or suppression, like refusing to discuss what's happened. Whereas other people, it's this kind of dramatization, like this feeling that they can't stop talking about it. And some people just constantly need to analyze what's happened. And other people just have to kind of enter this like flight state of, you know, completely changing, moving away, changing who they are, for example, to kind of cope with, yeah, that rupture. So yeah, I would just kind of ask you to reflect on like, how do you commonly express distress? Like, is it kind of more anxiety, or is it a sensation of grief, or are you someone whose sleep just goes off like as soon as you're experiencing something stressful or distressing? You know, like that's why I think the course is important, because it introduces like this whole diversity of ways we can express distress. And that's like a key way of finding which plant medicines are going to hopefully be allies and work with us, because yeah, we all kind of have unique ways of expressing trauma and distress, and therefore there's also plants that can help with those kind of corresponding ways that we're expressing distress. Okay, I hope that made sense. So now I'm just going to give like a teeny introduction to the nervous system, before I dive into like plants, and their kind of, yeah, offerings for people experiencing trauma. So I've just shared a couple of posts on my Instagram, actually, with like nice graphics and things about explaining these nervous system states. And oh my God, it is so difficult to talk about them in like any brevity. But you may have heard me mention before the sympathetic nervous system. So this is like a network of nerves through our body that enables the body to kind of act. You know, it's like a state of mobilization. It activates our fight or flight response. You know, say we see a car like coming at us at 60 miles an hour, our body is going to communicate to us like, right, we need to get the fuck out of the way, and we're going to get adrenaline. You know, there's going to be like a whole range of physiological effects, like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, faster metabolism, like so many things. increase strength, then that's going to just enable us to like achieve our safety, or try and achieve our safety. So this is just such a brief introduction, but the sympathetic nervous system has so many functions, but when it's in this state kind of longer term or chronically, that's when we start to have like health issues. I talk about these in like a binary, but I say in the course how they're definitely not a binary, and there's like much more complicated kind of things to do with these nervous system states. I don't know if you can hear the dog snoring in the background, but he's really distracting me. So the parasympathetic nervous system is another, network of nerves that helps us to like rest and digest our food. The short acronym is like rest and digest. So in this state, we are supported to have, increased immunity. We can feel a sense of calmness and connection and a sensation of safety. And there's like really this ability to like feel safe and social and to kind of relate to other people and, non-humans. And in this state, this is when the body like repairs itself, right? It conserves the energy of the body and it repairs tissues, which is why when you're in a really chronic state of stress and you get a long-term chronic illness, it's very difficult to kind of, enable the body's kind of natural inclination to move towards like self-healing, because we need to be in this nervous system state to enable that to happen, which is why people that have experienced significant trauma, like it's a real challenge, especially if you've grown up as a kid being in like a dominant sympathetic fight or flight state. And herbs are fucking amazing because they can be our biggest teachers in cultivating an understanding of how we feel when we're in this more kind of calm parasympathetic state. And this state is really essential for like preparing us for sleep. It triggers like a whole raft of physiological effects, like lowering our blood pressure, for example. So in the course, I do a real deep dive into the different nervous system states through this framework of like the polyvagal theory. And I'm not going to introduce that now because that's like a whole other podcast, but you can Google it. And the sort of different states that I introduce in much more depth with examples and things are safe and social. So this is our kind of parasympathetic state where, we're able to connect with people. We feel socially engaged. And that's very different, for example, to being in the fight response, which is when we might feel like anger or hostility or irritability, like desire to argue with people, like muscle tension, stuff like this. Whereas flight often is more like we just need to get out of there, and there's, again, it's so impossible to abbreviate these states, but flight might look like bursting into tears, for example. It's just this kind of desperate need to kind of, to distance ourselves from whatever's triggering us, if that makes sense. Sorry, that's not the greatest explanation. It's so hard to summarize these states, but generally flight is us like, needing to kind of move away. And then there's shutdown. So this is actually a type of kind of parasympathetic state. So it's not just kind of calm, but it's actually like if you think of a possum, it's like playing dead. It's like when our system kind of shuts down. I give various examples of that, of people that have experienced trauma and how that can be a consequence for lots of people to be in like a really depressed, dissociated, shut down state. And then we have our like mixed states. So this is when we might have a lot of activation, but actually we're kind of frozen. So the freeze state is like the title of that. And play is like when we feeling safe and social and engaged, but actually we're kind of activated, that might be in sport or during sex or intimacy, for example. And then we have stillness. So that's when we're in kind of the parasympathetic state, but, we're also, again, feeling kind of safe and social, but in a like a still way. So I dive into those in so much detail in the course. But I'm going to move into talking about herbal support now. And I just want to give the context of these so that, this section makes sense. Okay, so just before I dive into the herbal stuff, there is an entire module in the course which includes a trauma response framework, which is looking at collective responses to stress. And you can, read about this a little bit on the course page, but it's basically structured as rest and renew, So that's basically after any kind of traumatic experience, like the body will need to rest. For example, I'm sure if people have lost someone they love, they'll know that after a big kind of bereavement, that like there comes this kind of wave of exhaustion, and like a desperate need for kind of hibernation and isolation and to rest. And I've got here renew. So it's like we need to basically have resources to recover from those experiences. And herbs are like one part of that toolkit, right? That can help us rest and can also help us renew in terms of repairing tissues. But all of these like frameworks demand, are part of like collective responses. So in the course, I talk about what are the ways we can like connect with other people, and rest with other people, for example. And the next phase of the framework is reconnect. So like, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but we need other people. Like humans need humans. Like no matter how much we think we don't, we really do. And so it's all about how can we like move towards like social connection and reconnection. And plants are fantastic at helping us stretch that muscle and build those muscles in connection, because we can trust plants. Like they're not humans, non-humans are incredibly healing because they're very different to people, especially for people who've experienced trauma. And then there's also release, which actually I should have talked about first in this framework, but it's not a linear framework. Like it is cyclical and non-linear, but release is like generally if someone's been through a kind of traumatic experience, like then we've got all that like embodied energy, that rage, that anger, that irritability and frustration, and that needs to come out, and maybe that comes out in like intense physical exercise, or maybe that comes out with screaming or singing or some sort of creative project. But release is like a fundamental part of kind of trauma response. And I've also included like resistance and revolution. So we need to be addressing the causes of trauma, and a lot of people that have gone through something traumatic have then gone on to help other people that are experiencing that, whether that's survivors of sexual violence going on to support other survivors, or ex-prisoners going on to organize prisoner solidarity and abolitionist stuff. It's like, what is the point in recovering and healing and doing all of this work to try and feel like a bloody human again if we can't then kind of support other people and try and address the causes of the trauma, which are like nearly all political, right? Well, they are all political. So anyway, just disclaimer before I get into the herbal things, that I include this kind of whole module about collectivity and sort of structural change and how we can respond to trauma together. Okay. All right. So in terms of herbal support for trauma, like I've said, I've got like a massive 8-module course all about this, and I'm trying so hard to summarize it. But I am a real passionate kind of relational herbalist, in the sense of I think it is the act of herbalism that is healing. So it's not just like, oh, I took this tincture and it helped me with this, and this symptom. It's actually like, no, I am building relationships with plants and practicing herbalism, learning like herbal skills. And that is what's really healing, because herbalism is really based on relationships. Plant medicines can kind of transform your life by enabling this deeper relationship with the land, which is like super restorative because of, all the things, colonialism, industrialism, like capitalism, like everything, all the forces in the world that are trying to separate us and sever us from the land are kind of traumatizing us in different ways. And therefore, reconnecting with the land and having a relationship with the world is like, in my opinion, like intrinsically kind of healing, in just like so many ways that so many people have talked about and described and things. Okay, so plant medicines can also really actually help with kind of tangible health challenges as well. For example, improving our sleep and digestion, preventing, chronic disease and reducing inflammation that is likely to be occurring because of this like chronic overactivation of the nervous system. And just, aiding the nervous system to rest and recover while we're doing like challenging, difficult work, like, surviving in this world and resisting oppression. So I just, before I go into all of the plant things, I just want to cover my bases that I encourage you to kind of research herbal safety and, don't start working with a plant just because of something I've recommended here. Do further research, check any contraindications. If this herb is safe in pregnancy or safe with any like medication or pharmaceuticals you're taking, etc., etc. Okay, so what are nervines? So just a loose definition, they are herbs with an affinity for the nervous system. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the different kinds. So I'm going to talk about relaxant nervines, cardiac nervines, hypnotic nervines, nerve tonics, and stimulating nervines. All right, so the first category is relaxant nervines, and these help the body reduce the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So that's why I try to introduce these kind of two nervous system states. So these herbs can kind of like tone down that like fight or flight response, and they can also support us to access a more parasympathetic system state. So they can help trigger feelings of relaxation and rest and recovery. Generally, their kind of common actions is they often help reduce anxiety and they can aid sleep. Many of them have an action like that helps lower blood pressure. And yeah, we have this word in herbalism called a carminative, and it basically means something that's kind of calming and antispasmodic on the guts. And they can also help relieve tension like elsewhere in the body. And they often have like a direct action on neurotransmitters, which is something I talk about more in depth in the Herbalism, PTSD and Traumatic Stress course, where I sort of go into common neurotransmitters and different research around herbal medicine and that. But yeah, some of the common ones that I profile like in depth in the course include lavender, lemon balm, chamomile, catnip, and feverview. And I like to think of relaxant nervines as like really fantastic for that kind of background anxiety, like that background activation where we don't feel good, if that makes sense. Like we feel that underlying anxiety, like almost like you've got a browser open with like 50 tabs. Like that's what I think anxiety can feel like to lots of people. So relaxant nervines just like help close the tabs. Does that make any sense? I feel like that's such an Aquarian metaphor. Okay, so yeah, the kind of next category that I explore in the course are cardiac nervines. And I just want to say that these herbs can be in like multiple categories, right? Like many of these ones I'm going to talk about now are also relaxant nervines. But yeah, cardiac nervines can support the nervous system through their affinity with the heart and the cardiovascular system. And in the course, I like do a kind of introduction to herbal energetics, but we have these kind of this language of, and traditional medicine systems all over the world have had this. We have a language of, is something cooling or warming or moistening or drying, for example. And our kind of cardiac nervines are commonly cooling, and they're often moistening as well. But not always. But yeah, they can also kind of support the emotional heart, like especially around kind of grief and everything like heart related, like heartbreak. So yeah, the herbs that I profile in the course include yarrow, hawthorn, motherwort, rose, and linden flowers, or some people call them lime flowers. But yeah, they have a ton of amazing actions. Like I've said, a lot of them are relaxants, so they have this relaxant action through the body, helping relax muscles and blood vessels, which is really important when we're in sort of fight or flight, because that has such an impact on our sort of vasculature. They can help reduce blood pressure. They often contain flavonoids, which help kind of protect the vasculature from oxidative stress and damage. There's like a whole load of stuff in the course around how trauma relates to chronic illness. So if we're thinking about things like inflammation in the cardiovascular system, or having more kind of glucose in the blood, for example, blood sugar issues, that's often because people are in fight or flight a lot, right? And if you're experiencing trauma or systemic oppression that's putting you in fight or flight more, you're going to have more risk to things like type 2 diabetes, for example. But yeah, hawthorn can be very protective, like with the arteries and blood vessels in general. And yeah, I've mentioned about cholesterol. And they, some of these cardiac nervines can also help with the kind of circulation in the heart itself, helping with things like angina. Yeah. And, they can also help with like things like heart palpitations or heart activity rhythm. For example, motherwort is got like specific cardiotonic properties. And things like, say someone's experiencing a panic attack and is having like a lot of heart palpitations, that might be an indication for working with cardiac nervines. And yeah, they can also really support with sleep, like lime flowers, for example. So yeah, I dive into detail in the course about all of these plants in detail. But yeah, they're really just the most beautiful category of plants. Not that plants fit into neat categories by any means. So another kind of area of herbalism that can support with trauma recovery is hypnotic or like sedative nervines. So like I mentioned, when I talk about how trauma affects the body, sleep disturbances are really, what is like extremely common in terms of, people having gone through trauma, like being very affected commonly by insomnia or nightmares or struggling to get to sleep, for example. So yeah, these herbs can really help with those different areas. They can also have a kind of, again, a strong like antispasmodic action for pain and tension. If you're someone who experiences stress a lot in terms of like musculoskeletal pain, then yeah, they can help trigger this sort of state of relaxation. I think it's really important to talk about like the nuances of these, and lots of people who've experienced trauma, like sometimes that is in a kind of sedated state. Just content warning here. But say, for example, you've been sexually assaulted in your sleep, like many of us have, then it makes complete sense that the body would not want to fall asleep or not want to like be in that sedated state again. Like I've been sober, for example, since 2017 because I just got fucking tired of being sexually assaulted when I was kind of drunk or in like an altered state. And so, yeah, like I think working with herbs that can alter your state is kind of tricky territory for people. Might not be appropriate for people, for example, in recovery. Yeah, so that's, those are like the nuances that I talk about a lot in the course, and it's important to sort of say that. But yeah, examples of these herbs can include like mugwort, California poppy, hops, wild lettuce, passion flower, skullcap, valerian, and others. Those are some of the babes that I profile in the course in more depth. And yeah, I've just done a little series on Instagram about like herbal support for nightmares. And I actually talk about some of these, and people have been like sharing in the comments their experiences of, hey, mugwort gave me nightmares, or, I had much worse nightmares with valerian. I found it really stimulating. And yeah, it's just been really interesting and fascinating to hear like other people's experiences with these plants. Okay, so nerve tonics are also like another, I keep saying like the same bloody adjectives, like amazing, incredible, but just herbs are amazing and incredible, FYI. And if you do the course, you will be completely hooked. But yeah, these nerve tonics are like the foundation of my practice as a herbalist. So they're really kind of supporting to like tonify and strengthen and like restore the kind of proper functioning and structure of the nervous system. So yeah, the plants that I explore in the course include milky oats, betony, licorice, St. John's wort, tulsi, evening primrose, elderberry, schizandra, ashwagandha, vervain, and others. And yeah, they have, they're like hard to categorize because they have like such a diverse spectrum of medicinal actions like across them. But generally, we're working with nerve tonics to, achieve things like addressing nutritional deficiencies or, literally helping with the, like repair of the nervous system. So in the nervous system deep dive, I go through, like just like very basic stuff around like nerve cells and things. And one part of this is explaining about the myelin sheath, which is this kind of layer of fat that surrounds the nerves. And often people have nervous system issues when they have like a deficiency of fat in their diet, which is another reason why I make this like super heavenly lavender oil, because it's like a really fantastic way of getting fat to our cells without, necessarily eating it. But yeah, and I'm talking about kind of like healthy, nourishing fats here, like olive oil and avocados and things. But yeah, like plants can sort of help with the repair of that sheath, which means our nerves are communicating better, which means our whole nervous system is functioning better. Yeah, nerve tonics can also support the what we call the HPA axis. And again, I talk about this in the course in detail, but it's short for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this is like the kind of brain to adrenal glands, which are glands that sit on top of the kidneys that like are activated when we're in our kind of fight and flight response, and they communicate the body to, right, okay, let's go, like release adrenaline. release blood sugar, to move, all of this stuff. So herbs can like help this axis like to function better or to function more kind of optimally. It probably doesn't make any sense, but yeah, it makes sense in the course, because I go into, you know, research around plants like licorice, for example, and the adrenals. Nerve tonics can also, like the other categories, like help to address sleep disturbances, like more of a kind of longer term nature. They often have a lot of antioxidants, which are really supportive to all our cells, but especially the immune system. They can help with the production of various neurotransmitters. They often have an affinity with the liver, which is really important because the liver is what sort of metabolizes and processes our stress hormones and the sort of environmental demands that we're under, which is, you know, another, not sneaky, but another major cause of stress, especially in capitalism. So yeah, our nerve tonics are just doing so many things. They often help improve circulation to the brain, central nervous system. They've commonly got like a real like gut repair affinity as well. So there's so much information these days around gut flora and the microbiome and how that relates to inflammation and like the gut brain axis, and how like emotional health is like massively influenced by the strains of bacteria we have. Like this is just like a whole other world that's just like so fascinating. And again, it's something I explore in the course. I would love to do like another module like focusing more on this specifically. But yeah, these nerve tonics often have like an affinity with the GI tract. They can also help with like nerve pain issues like sciatica, or, you know, address things like blood sugar imbalances that contribute to anxiety. So yeah, a whole plethora of actions that can really help. I think nerve tonics are really fantastic at like preventing burnout, but also sustaining you in times when actually you really just need a rest, but you can't. You know, for example, someone you love's died and you have to kind of keep going and organize the funeral and do all the things, like that's when nerve tonics really come into their own. But they also are like formidable when we're like recovering from periods of chronic stress and trauma and exhaustion. Yeah, they're real allies. And the last category I wanted to introduce are stimulating nervines. So yeah, these are again herbs with an affinity for the nervous system, but they have like a gentle stimulating action. And when I talked about the nervous system states, I know it was a teeny tiny introduction, but not everyone is in this like fight or flight, fierce aggression, kind of hyper anxious, hyper angry state. Like lots of people are actually very shut down, and have like a depression of function. So they might feel depressed emotionally, but they might also have a depression of function in terms of more fatigue, or, you know, like a kind of lack of movement, or like feelings of brain fog, you know, like problems with their blood pressure, like, you know, like POTS, like things like this can often be when someone is in this like shutdown state. And yeah, like we don't necessarily want to work with like hardcore stimulants like coffee that can, you know, maybe tip someone over the edge, because sometimes in this state, it's still quite likely that there's like this fight or flight kind of activation in the background, but it's kind of like trapped. Does that make sense? It will all make sense in the course, like in the polyvagal lesson. But yeah, like our gentle stimulants can help with getting blood flow to the brain. They can, yeah, help kind of people feel a bit more like uplifted, like recover some kind of vitality. And they often have like neuroprotective like antioxidants, which makes them like really fantastic for things like headaches and migraines and concentration. And you know, they often also have an affinity with the gut. They're often very warming and drying or antimicrobial. Again, just this like gut brain axis is so interesting, and they're often sort of relaxant as well, but not in a kind of like sedating sense, but in a kind of muscle tension relaxing, like antispasmodic way. So some of the stimulating nervines I explore in the course include rosemary, hyssop, sage, and thyme. So yeah, so that is just like really brief introduction to how herbs can support with trauma. Like I mentioned earlier, it is the act of herbalism that is really, really healing. It is the foraging, the gardening, the feeling let alone, because you're like connected to this like web of life, you know, like that's the stuff that's really life changing. But when we're kind of like dancing, so to speak, with the world, like we're experiencing these different expressions of distress, whether that's nightmares or flashbacks or feeling rage and anger, like herbs can play a massive role in supporting us. They can help us, like, you know, move those emotions through us, like express our grief, express our feelings. They can help kind of calm us down, and they can also help stimulate us, right? So yeah, they are just really flexible. And, you know, the Herbalism PTSD and traumatic stress course is like, I'd like to say it's a one of a kind course, but it really is like an in-depth introduction to all of these plants. So yeah, you know, and you also learn all the medicine making and how to prepare them and where to start if you're overwhelmed. Like, do you work with this plant or this plant or this plant? Yeah, I've kind of put all of that in a really structured way. So yeah, it's open until the 13th of April. So please jump in there. There's a whole episode about the sliding scale and why no one is turned away for lack of funds. But please, yeah, listen to that and don't hesitate to join it for free if you need. I did put an email out recently asking people to share it on their networks. I'm so grateful to everyone that's done that, because it's just made a world of difference in terms of who the course can reach and generating some funds and stuff, because this course, you know, funds like all of this stuff, you know, all of this work in the world. So yeah, I'm just so grateful for everyone's interest. And yeah, it will be open again for enrollment at the end of October this year. But if you want to kind of embrace the spring now and yeah, start your journey with plants or deepen it, you know, maybe you're already a herbalist if you're listening to this podcast. But yeah, I think herbs are like the most amazing allies in terms of accompanying us through a lifetime of, you know, potential stressful and difficult and traumatic experiences. And, you know, they can help us show up for others as well. So yeah, please check out the course. And yeah, thank you for listening. Okay, take care.
Thanks so much for listening to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. You can find the transcript, the links, all the resources from the show at solidarityApothecary.org/podcast.